Well, let's now talk about levels of organization. So the human body exists in many different levels of organization. So if we look at the very smallest or fundamental level of organization, we can see that we're made of this thing called atoms. Okay, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, a little bit of iron, different kinds of materials like that. What's really interesting about atoms is they have bonding properties where they can join together to form molecules. Molecules are going to be larger structures that are made of atoms. So you can take atoms like hydrogen and oxygen, both explosive gases, combine them together, and you get a new material that forms from that, a new emergent material called a molecule. That molecule has different properties than the atoms that were used to put the molecule together. So emergent properties we can see when we put molecules together like proteins, nucleic acids, sugars, and fats. We can build these things called organelles. Organelles are cell parts. They're little organs inside the cells. If we put enough of these little organelles together, we can form cells. And if we take cells that are like each other and put them together, we can form tissues. Tissues, if we combine different kinds of tissues, we have 4 kinds of tissues: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular. If we put those tissues together, we can form organs. And then, of course, the next level of organization is where you put organs together and we can form organ systems. So what's interesting is that we have this property where we can use building blocks. We can use atoms, molecules, cell parts, cells, tissues, organs. We can use these building blocks to make more complex structures in the human body. Now, what's interesting, I don't know if you figured out what exactly you're going to do with your life, but if you are interested in studying, the human body and finding a job, there's jobs at every level of organization. Of course, we have chemists at the chemical level. We have molecular biologists at the molecular level. We have at the cellular level, we have cytologists that deal with learning about cells. We have histologists that study tissues, and pathologists also study tissues as well. And at the organ system level, we have doctors and nurses that are working to keep these systems functioning. So put everything together, you form the organism. So we are made of many different levels of organization. Now, if we talk about how we, will deal with the human body and organize it in this class, we're going to look at the human body as having these particular major features. The human body has cavities. Cavities are spaces where organs can sit. We're going to look that the cavities are lined with membranes, and most of your organs are covered by a membrane, and this creates boundaries for the organs. And then, of course, we are made of organ systems. So if we start with cavities, we know that there are these cavities called dorsal cavities. Dorsal cavities are the cavities in our back side of our body. And then we have ventral cavities, which are cavities toward the front side of our body. So let's look at the dorsal cavities. We have sitting in the dorsal cavity called the cranial cavity, we have the brain up here. And then sitting inside the vertebral cavity, we have the spinal cord going through the center of our vertebrae. So those are our dorsal cavities. So our ventral cavities will include the thoracic cavity, which has subdivisions to it, we'll see in a second. And then we have the abdominopelvic cavity, made up of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Now these cavities are continuous with each other, so there's nothing that separates them, but it is known as the abdominal pelvic cavity. Looking from a frontal view, you can see that the thoracic cavity is big space that is up here in the thorax of your body. This big space here is the thoracic cavity, and it's a space that houses other separate cavities. So you can see here we have the right pleural cavity, the left pleural cavity, holding the left and right lungs. We have the pericardial cavity surrounding the heart, and then we have this space called the mediastinum, which is this entire space right here, which houses the heart. It also houses the blood vessels coming into and out of the heart. So we have the superior vena cava and the aorta coming into and out of the heart. And there's a little gland called organ called the thymus here, and the trachea and the esophagus will go through that mediastinum, that space there. Separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity is this muscle here called the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the muscle that separates those two structures. And then we have the abdominal cavity here, and then the pelvic cavity here, housing some of your abdominal and pelvic organs. So as you normally would do, take and stop your video for a second and answer this question. The diaphragm separates which two body cavities? And then stop it, and then we'll talk about it in just a second. So does it separate the pelvic cavity from the abdominal cavity? No, it doesn't do that, so that's not the correct answer. How about the cranial cavity from the vertebral cavity? Doesn't do that one either. Thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity? Yes, that's the one that it does. So C is the correct answer for that particular question. Well, ventral cavities are going to house the visceral organs. Visceral organs known as the lungs, the heart, and then your abdominal organs. So most organs in the ventral cavities are going to be surrounded by serous membranes. Serous membranes produce a fluid called serous fluid, and that's a fluid that helps the membranes not stick together. It allows for the organs to have flexibility and movement if you squish them. It's a double layered, so when we talk about the membranes around the visceral organs in the ventral cavities, these membranes are double layered. I'll show you an image of that in just a second. The parietal layer of this double membrane layered system lines the cavity walls. The visceral layer covers the actual surface of the organ. So we have a visceral layer. Viscera literally means organ, covers the organ. The parietal means wall, lines the cavity walls. The serous fluid is a fluid in the cavity that separates the parietal layer from the visceral layer. It doesn't allow them to adhere together and stick together. So that serous fluid also has to be maintained in homeostasis. You don't want too much of it or too little of it so that the membranes stick together or there's too much pressure inside of the cavity. These have specific names. They usually are based on organs that they surround. And if we give you a couple of examples of that, the pericardial membranes or pericardium are the serous membranes that are going to surround the heart and make up the cavity around the heart. The pleurae or pleural membranes, pleurae is plural, these are going to be the membranes that are going to cover the lungs. And then the peritoneal or peritoneum collectively are the membranes that are going to cover the abdominal and pelvic cavities. Here's that double membrane layering that I was talking to you earlier about. So here we have the parietal layer, the actual wall that makes up the wall of the membrane, and then we have our wall of the cavity, and then we have the visceral layer. So if you stuck your hand into this balloon or this plastic bag, the covering the actual organ would be the visceral membrane, and then making up the outside wall is going to be the parietal membrane. In between, this little space in between is the cavity. And the fluid that you can see all in here would be the serous fluid. So, say an example using the heart, we have the parietal pericardium is going to be the parietal membrane. The pericardial space right there is going to be full of the serous fluid, and the visceral pericardium is going to cover the actual surface of the organ, in this case the heart. Peri means around, cardi means heart. It's important to learn root words, so if you have a medical terminology class, that would be very useful for you. In this class, we're going to do root words each time we have a new unit. Now, you don't really need to know anything from this particular graphic, except I just wanted you to realize that, from a CAT scan point of view, you can see, so this is a transverse view through this plane up here. So if you look at this top image here, it's a plane through your lungs and heart. And then we're looking at from a top view, you can see the visceral membrane, you can see the parietal membrane, and then you can see, in this case, this is the pleural cavity. So you can see the visceral membrane going around the heart, and then the parietal membrane making up the wall of that cavity. Okay, so that's just showing you from that point of view. Here's a different point of view going through the abdominal region, and you can see the visceral peritoneum, okay, covering the actual organ, and then the parietal peritoneum making up the wall. So we have parietal and visceral making up the two sections there. But there are no membranes like serous membranes that cover the brain inside the cranium. It has this thing called meninges that cover it. But this is the cavity that holds the brain. So this cranial cavity up here holds the brain, and but it does not have a serous membrane. Neither does the spinal cord going through the vertebral cavity. Just a quick review of organ systems. So you probably know these organ systems here. We have the skin, hair, and nails. This makes up what we call the integumentary system. Very important system, making up a boundary and protecting you from the outside forces like bacteria and viruses. Also holding your good stuff in. So here we have a pelvic bone, a coxal bone, a femur, and then we have the lumbar vertebrae and thoracic vertebrae and spine. This makes up part of the skeletal system. Each of these systems we'll cover in detail as we get into deeper parts of this class. Well, here you can see the serratus anterior, the external oblique, and the latissimus dorsi. This is part of the muscular system. Over here we have the brain and spinal cord and nerves coming out. This is the nervous system. So a system that's spread all throughout your body, that has many organs and glands all throughout your body, including the pancreas, the thymus, the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland, pineal gland, testes, ovaries. This is the endocrine system. Pretty complicated system, but we'll study that one second semester. Over here we have the heart and the blood vasculature, the arteries and the veins. This makes up the cardiovascular system. Kind of an interesting system, since we're living through a pandemic at this point in time, is the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is made up of lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, the bone marrow, red bone marrow specifically, and this is the system that helps us to get rid of microorganisms out of our body. It also deals with cancer cells and those kinds of things. Over here we have the trachea and the bronchial tubes and the lungs, and this makes up our respiratory system. So a very big system in our body is the digestive system, made up of the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, and an accessory organ such as the gallbladder and the liver and the pancreas, not shown in this picture. That's called the digestive system. Your kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra make up your urinary system. And then finally we have the reproductive systems that are made up of individual organs such as the testes, the uterus, the ovaries, and we'll discuss male and female reproductive systems at the very end of this particular course. So never think of the organs as being separate from all the other systems in the body. We want to always think of organ systems that working cooperatively with each other. There's an interrelationship between all of these systems. This graphic shows very clearly that the kidneys have a job to perform. They're part of the excretory system. They help to excrete waste out of our body, such as urine. But, they do have to be fed. We get nutrients in from the digestive system. The nutrients cannot get to the kidneys unless we had a circulatory system. So that's how we get the nutrients over to the kidneys. Excuse me. The kidneys also require oxygen, and they require getting rid of the waste product carbon dioxide. So we have to have the respiratory system aiding the kidneys in that job. So every system is going to be interrelated with every other system in the human body, and we really want to think of it in that kind of way. What I want to do now, since we've talked about body cavities, and we've talked a little bit about organ systems, is I want to talk about anatomical terminology, how we describe, where things are located, body positions, regional names, how we describe where things are directionally, and then talk about the sections of the body. So in anatomical position, this should be feet spread apart right here, and this is kind of a bad diagram, sorry about that. But body should be facing forward. The hands our palms are facing forward, and the legs are about width of body of the shoulders apart. This is what we call front. So the back side or posterior side, it would be the back side not shown in this particular graphic. A body laying looking at the ground, so it's called supine. The person's in a supine position. So you can see the guy, look at him, he's looking up at the sky, so that's a supine position. If you're puckering up and kissing the ground, you're considered to be prone. These are just terms we use to describe a body laying on the ground, either facing up or looking down. So it's really important, as you do a lab or look in your textbook, that you use, the textbook to see images such as this. These are regional terms. Every part of the body has a regional term ascribed to it. It's really, really critical that you learn regional terms. It makes your life so much better when you know these regional terms as you go forward in understanding anatomy. So spend some time, look through these things. I'll just give you an example of why it's important to know regional terms, and I'll give you an example using the word frontal. So if you know the word frontal, that you know that's your forehead, underneath that skin there's a muscle called the frontalis. Underneath of that there's a bone called the frontal bone. Underneath that bone there's a lobe of the brain called the frontal lobe. So it would be really to your advantage to understand the word frontal, because later on, as you go through different systems of the body, we name things based on these regional surface names. So please spend some time and know that there's front terms and there's back terms. There's anterior terms and posterior terms. So get a sense of that by studying that from looking at textbook pictures or in your lab manual. So there's also directional terms, and I'll show you how these are used, but let me show you their pairing. So we use the words superior and inferior together. Anterior and posterior are used together. Medial and lateral are used together. Proximal and distal are terms, directional terms that we use together. And superficial and deep are terms that we use together. So there's graphics like this in your lab manual and also in your textbook that help you to learn these particular terms. So when we talk about an appendage, so say the arm right here, so we use this arm right here, we use the words proximal and distal. Proximal means getting closer to the attachment point. Distal means moving further away from the attachment point. So our most distal part of our body is probably the tip of our middle finger. The most proximal part of our arm is probably up here where you have the humerus attaching in to the shoulder. Okay, so proximal and distal. When we talk about the trunk of the body and the head, we use the terms superior and inferior. So going closer to the top of the head is more superior, going down is more inferior. So when we talk about going from the side is lateral, going to the midline or middle of the body is called medial. So here I'm going more medial. Here I'm going more lateral. So these are directional terms that we use to describe going more to the midline or going more to the side. Superficial is closer to the surface of the skin or surface, and then going more into the body is considered to be deep. And then of course we have anterior is the front of the body and posterior is the back of the body. So spend a minute, go ahead and pause your video and look at this question. Which pair of terms could be used to describe the location of the nose when compared to the location of the eyes? So pause your video and make your answer. So when we take and look at the location of the nose compared to the location of the eyes, the nose is going to be, so which of these did you pick? Did you pick the nose as medial and superior to the eyes? That wouldn't be correct. Did you say it was lateral and proximal to the eyes? That would not be correct. How about medial and distal to the eyes? Well, we use the word distal when we use appendages, not the nose. So that's not correct. Medial towards the midline and inferior. Well, yes, that is true. It is medial, more to the midline, and it is below the eye, which we would use the word inferior to describe that. So now let's talk about sectioning the body. So when we look at the human body, we can cut it into different sections so we can get a better understanding of how the organs are arranged and how the parts are arranged. We have a transverse section, which is where you can cut through the body in this particular plane. We do have a frontal plane, which is kind of hard to see in this, but it's kind of like taking and slicing your body like in this particular direction. If you look at where my hand is on my head, I'm cutting in this direction. And then we do have, so we have transverse, we have frontal, and then we have sagittal, which is cutting through the midline and dividing the body into right and left halves. So using a brain, you can see the brain looks very different from a mid-sagittal section. This is cutting right through the middle part of the brain and making it into right and left halves. And then while we're looking at it, we're looking at the inside of it here in this particular graphic. But if we take and do a frontal plane, okay, also known as a coronal plane, we can see that the brain has a very different structural organization that we can now appreciate. And then if we looked at the transverse plane, again, we can see a different view of the brain in this particular cut. If we take it all together, sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes, if we take them all together, we can really get a very good understanding of not only the brain, but of other body parts as we cut through them in these particular reference planes. So let's go ahead and we'll finish up our conversation by doing quadrants. So when we look at the abdominopelvic cavities, we can take and make quadrants by going through the umbilical scar and the top of the hips, and then going through a mid-sagittal cut. We then get an upper left quadrant, so in anatomical position, this is the cadaver's left side, and that's what we call left. Here's the upper right quadrant. We have the lower right quadrant and lower left quadrant. By making a quadrant system, we can learn and study what organs are found in those particular quadrants. Now, if you go into a healthcare field, it's important to understand the quadrants because you can do things like inspection, you can do palpation, you can do percussion, and you can do auscultation to understand if there's any kind of damage to those organs. So I can visually inspect the area with skin still intact, and I can know if I see a swelling or a discoloration, I could understand what organs might be affected from some kind of trauma that a person has experienced. I can tap lightly on these organs and understand if they're full or hollow. So I can see if blood is pooling or if there's something abnormal about them by doing percussion or tapping on these organs in different quadrants. I can do palpation where I can push on the abdomen of the patient, and if I know where all the different organs are, I can palpate the edges of the organs. I can palpate to see if I feel tumors or if I feel anything that's unusual. And then I can also take my stethoscope and listen to the different organs in the different quadrants so I can see if they sound differently. Each organ does have a unique sound and what we would consider to be a normal sound, and then organs have abnormal sounds that they make as well. So if you do plan to go into a further healthcare field, it's definitely important in use of your time to understand what organs are found in the different quadrants. So take a minute and you can just answer this question. So pause your video. Which abdominopelvic quadrant contains the stomach? Okay. And so you would probably be right if you said that the upper left quadrant contains the stomach. But the right upper also contains a piece of the stomach as well. So it's found in multiple sections or multiple quadrants. Well, if you really take your learning seriously and you go into some kind of healthcare field, it might be to your advantage to learn the 9-quadrant system. So we have the right hypochondriatic region, the epigastric region, the left hypochondriatic region, right lumbar region, the umbilical region, left lumbar region, right iliac, hypogastric, left iliac. The way they draw these lines in is they will take and draw below the ribs, right above the pelvic bones, and then they draw in 2 lines on either side of the umbilical scar or the belly button, and now you got your quadrants there. It's a more specific way to really understand edges of organs and where different organs are located, and you might want to take the challenge to try to learn some of that. So you can pause your video for a second. The small intestine is located primarily in which region? And of course you would say it's located primarily in the umbilical region, but it also is found in other parts, in other quadrants in that 9-quadrant system. Well, we've taken a look through the human body. We've talked about anatomy and physiology and what definitions of those are. We looked at requirements of the human body and needs of the human body. We've also looked at how we organize the human body. So we will see you next time in the next video. Good luck studying, be a great student, and study frequently in small doses. Take care.